22nd event in the Philosophy Talk series organized by Marmara University, Department of Philosophy. It is a great honor and pleasure for us to welcome Professor Linda Martin Alcoff to our online meeting today. Professor Alcoff is a professor of philosophy at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is one of the most important contemporary philosophers working at the intersection of epistemology, phenomenology, feminist philosophy, critical philosophy of race, decolonial thought, and social identity. She has also served as a president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association, and her work has had a decisive influence far beyond the borders of academic philosophy. Among many works of Professor Alcoff, her books include Visible Identities, Race, Gender, and the Self, which won the Franz Fanon Award, The Future of Whiteness, and Rape and Resistance. I would especially like to mention her most recent book, Race and Racism, A Decolonial Approach, published by Oxford University Press in 2025. The book is also based on her prestigious Adorno Lectures in Frankfurt, delivered in 2022, under the title Race, Culture, History. It is a privilege for us to host Professor Alcoff today, and she will speak on decolonizing epistemology in this talk. We are very grateful that she accepted our invitation, and we very much look forward to her lecture. Professor Alcoff, thank you again for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kader, and thank you for the invitation. This is very helpful for my work, so I can get your thoughts and your criticisms, but I really appreciate the invitation. So what I'm going to talk about in this paper is some work I've been doing on how to decolonize epistemology and also how to decolonize the philosophy of science. And I'm building on, a growing community of philosophers who are working on this topic. But we're still in early days, I think, of thinking about this particular issue. I think that today Western science can no longer be presented in any scholarly meeting as a spontaneous invention, and the category of Western science is increasingly understood as an amalgamation that, took from sciences, especially in your part of the world. Science, technology in general is also today, I think, more and more understood as requiring a contextual analysis, meaning a social and political context. There are many controversies about this and efforts in the United States today, of course, to shut this research project down. But I think these trends are beginning to move into the mainstream of the academy as well as public media, and they're not going to be easily, erased or forgotten. So what I'm going to talk about today is the motivation for decolonizing epistemology and some ways to do it, and argue for four corrective norms in a non-ideal approach. I think what may give us some hope that this project will continue is, ironically, the dire state of the planet. Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena, who are two Latin American philosophers and anthropologists of science, write that today the global north is as threatened as the worlds they displaced and destroyed, as threatened by climate disasters. But most of the current proposals, they argue, quote, share an unsurprising, if discouraging, trait in common, it seems almost impossible for them to imagine a response to the ecological crisis that does not take the world that is responsible for the destruction of the planet as the exclusive starting point for developing solutions. How can this be so? How is it that true global scientific collaborations are so difficult to imagine? So I want to lay out a sense of what a decolonial turn requires in the sphere of epistemology. And this work is beginning. There's these books like Ethno-Epistemology with Jonardon Ganeri's work that I really recommend, Global Epistemologies and Philosophy of Science Today, um, that is producing comparative epistemologies that correct our histories. But in this beginning stage, I think we need to focus a little bit on the philosophical motivations for decolonizing epistemology. It's not simply political, it's also epistemological. And there's a recent essay by Soren Harnau Clausen who looks at how the social sciences, especially anthropology and sociology, have been exploring for some time a comparative ethnographic analysis of the history of knowledge in their fields. But philosophers are a little bit behind. Um, and he hypothesizes that this lack of concern by philosophers is explained by the fact that epistemologists focus on truth, which they take to be a generic universal. Many in the social sciences, by contrast, have often say up front, they're not going to look at truth, they're going to set truth aside in order to study the practices of knowing, separate from the question of their truth conduciveness. And so they study epistemic practices in the same way they might study social customs. Clausen argues that while this approach may have some utility of setting truth aside, we also need to study diverse epistemic practices that will, in a way that retains an epistemological perspective that is concerned with the truth conduciveness of these diverse practices. And he argues we can do this in a way that does not require, setting culture aside. So I'm going to begin with a picture of contemporary Western science in its real world form. And it's helpful here to recall Thomas Kuhn's surprise he wrote about when he studied the history of science, which helped him to change his general understanding of how science worked. Here's a quotation from Kuhn. He says, "To my complete surprise, exposure to out-of-date scientific theory and practice radically undermined some of my basic conceptions about the nature of science and the reasons for its special success. If these out-of-date beliefs are to be called myths, then myths can be produced by the same sorts of methods and held for the same sorts of reasons that now lead to scientific knowledge." Unquote. So what he's explaining here is that he could better understand earlier scientific methods and practices that seemed obviously inadequate once he understood that the scientists who were using those different methods and practices conceived of their projects differently than he was at his time, that they were operating with what he came to call a different paradigm, which included different ontological suppositions as well as different functional goals. And all can come under the umbrella of science. So you can have different paradigms coming under one umbrella of science, meaning that they were all pursuing some cognitive contact with the world, right? They were trying to learn something empirical, some kind of cognitive contact through empirical methods. So based on this approach, Stephen Jay Gould and Sandra Harding have both argued, for example, that the racist brain studies that were done in the 19th century could be critiqued without contesting their claims to be science. They were science. The racist brain studies were science, according to Gould and Harding. These were studies of phrenology that tried to link mental capacity to the size and shape of the brain, of the cranial shape and size. And they argue that to deny phrenology's status as a science is to risk immortalizing our current approaches, to assume that in the past they had faulty paradigms, but today we are free of these. So I think the power of the concept of the Kuhnian paradigm was that it put empirical practices in context and could assess both strengths and weaknesses without assuming that science could escape the necessity of prior assumptions, certain kinds of models, the arbitrary availability of concepts that they had in their time. And for Kuhn, this is what endangers the sciences by rendering today's paradigms beyond critique, even invisible. So, part of what has driven the colonialist attitude to other sciences has been the West's mythology about its own sciences as universal, without the effects of partiality or without the effects of paradigms in this way. The lessons of these debates over the history of science and the many still ongoing mistaken projects in science is that we need to have a more robust understanding of contextual influences. Context not only affects what questions are asked, but which questions get funded, and also the models, the concepts, and the methods we use in formulating our questions and our approach to them. So, so the West does not possess a model of empirical science to which the formerly colonized parts of the world might be measured against, right? So the idea that the West is the universal yardstick, and then we measure the rest of the sciences against this. We're all operating in specific contexts. And, it's as Janardhan Ganeri has been arguing, uh, there is no singular epistemic method. And it's certainly the case that there's a lot of predictive efficacy in Western sciences. Certainly, good vaccines have been produced by rich countries. Military drones, unfortunately, hit their targets. Ships make it to the moon when they're not blown up, as the recent one was a couple of weeks ago in the United States. Although, and Mexico right now is threatening to sue Elon Musk's SpaceX because he's been shooting amazing amount of pollution debris from his rockets that has caused by the failed rocket explosions. So there's a lot of efficacy happening in Western science, but there's also some disasters that get sort of um, uh, sh sh pushed aside. Failures are, of course, a natural part of science, but the worry that many analysts have is whether the West has the tools or the will to correctly assess and learn from its failures. To quote Wittgenstein, a picture held us captive. This is the picture of a spectacularly successful Western science that holds us captive. Charles Taylor and Hubert Dreyfus suggested that Wittgenstein uses the word picture here to denote not a theory so much as, quote, a largely unreflected upon background understanding which provides the context and thus influences our theorizing, unquote. And Frieder Vogelmann in Germany has been arguing that the most powerful element of the picture is the separation of reason and power, as if these are not co-constituting. The variation in how researchers conceptualize the entities they study means that it should not be so terribly difficult to grasp the idea of scientific pluralism, though, which means that we have to get rid of this picture. Karen North-Satina's work on epistemic cultures argues that epistemic pluralism has advantages for the empirical sciences. Rather than trying to collapse epistemic cultures into a single unified field theory, it would be better actually to maintain multiple ontologies, multiple contexts, while investigating their relationships. So the decolonial turn needs to do more than turn us away from myths about knowledge. We also need to see what it will turn us toward. And this is the basis of the 4 corrective norms that I want to lay out for you here. What is required is a new era of collaboration without Eurocentrism or assumptions that context does not matter. To imagine this dialogue and collaboration across diverse researchers today, we need to engage with the non-ideal context in place, a significant inequality of power and resources, the cultural racism that still is propagated by many nations, and all of the real-world obstacles that can sabotage our efforts at global collaboration. So toward this end, I propose 4 corrective norms. I'm going to explain. First, relational humility. Second, assessing the quality of epistemic relationships as an epistemic requirement of assessing the legitimacy of theoretical proposals. Third, acknowledging the incompleteness of all knowledge. And fourth, developing an inter-epistemology approach as a corrective to epistemic imperialism. So I'll group these in 2s. I'll talk about the first 2 first, and then the third and the fourth. In the Mahabharata, which is more than 2,000 years old, there's much written about knowledge, mainly expressed in parable or narrative form, but there are clearly described examples of bad knowing practices that are corrected in unexpected ways. The god Kausaka has an experience that troubles him deeply and causes him to question not only his self-control, but also the accuracy of his self-knowledge. What happens is a bird defecates on his head, and in anger, Kausaka uses his special powers to kill the bird. He quickly feels remorse, and he's motivated to go on a quest for a better understanding. Is it this kind of a parable for Western societies, I think, in some ways? So he's motivated to go on a quest for a better understanding of how to live a moral life. But this requires him to decide who he can learn from. And he surprisingly decides that to seek out a butcher and a housewife and to follow their advice on how to better himself. This is from an argument that Brenda Dalmia makes in her 2016 book, Caring to Know, that, quote, a certain kind of character is necessary for grasping truth, unquote. So there's an entwinement of ethics and knowledge seeking in which the cultivation of ethical virtues is seen as having an epistemic benefit. At one point, Dalmia makes a list of 13 ethical dispositions that are presented in the Mahabharata as paths to truth. They include truth speaking, equality and partiality, self-control, non-envy, forgiveness, shame, forbearance, not seeing fault in others, renunciation, meditation, nobility, patience, and non-injury. And some of these, I think, are intuitive to us, even those like me who are unfamiliar, with this tradition. But Dalmia explains that one's ethical practices are not collapsible to epistemic practices here, but they're entwined. They're in a necessary relationship. So these qualities are defined as paths to truth, not paths to a moral life. So although Kausika has a very high social status, he's motivated by shame to seek out the instruction of those positioned below him. And neither the butcher nor the housewife act obsequiously toward him. They don't tell him just what they think he wants to hear. They reprimand him, they make him wait, they let him know that his request is not as important to them as their daily chores. And in general, they act as if they know already that they're in a position to teach him. So here we can clearly see how some of the paths of knowing Dalmia lists are operative toward Kausika's epistemic goals, such as impartiality, forbearance, shame, and self-control. These are all relevant to Kausika's capacity to develop a meaningful relationship with the butcher and the housewife so that he might learn from this. So knowing is best achieved when one attends to the conditions and the quality of the relations involved among knowers, relations that require ethical conduct and self-examination so that all parties can work to achieve trust. Given various forms of structural power imbalances, Dalmia argues that such trust requires dominant parties like Kausika to start from a position of relational humility, which is the first corrected norm. Ever since Socrates avowed his own ignorance, Western philosophy has long honored epistemic humility. This is not new. But Socrates' humility has been formulated in a non-relational way. Socrates says, I know that I don't know, but you all don't know that you don't know. So even though I know that I don't know, I'm still superior to others. So Socrates' humility actually constitutes him as epistemically superior, which erodes his motivation to seek counsel. And usually, as we know, Socrates only consults others in order to tear their ideas to shreds. So as Dalmia says, the Socratic version does not lead to a space of possible knowledge of others. So relational humility is distinct from Socratic humility because it is both other-regarding and self-regarding. What makes the humility relational, she says, is a connection between these. We know that we don't know, and we know that you do know. Collaborations in many fields often involve a diversity of groups that have to work out their group relations. Alison Wiley has written extensively about the many collaborations occurring today in archaeology as archaeologists seek to confer with the descendant communities, the people who are descended from the communities in some cases that built those things that are being uncovered in archaeological digs. Wiley notes that many such collaborations begin from moral and political motives. Sites may have human remains or cultural artifacts that are connected to particular groups still in existence who have faced violence. And so the archaeologists are motivated for moral and political reasons to engage in this collaboration. But she reports that such motives of respect, acknowledgement, and reciprocity often then begin to move over into the epistemic domain. And the result is that the two sides begin to, quote, jointly define the research agenda and pursue programs of historical archaeological inquiry together, unquote. So when archaeologists exhibit relational humility and take a tempered approach to expertise, collaborations can produce what Wiley calls a transformative criticism in which research plans are modified. Now, philosophers such as, there are many philosophers who are skeptical of this, such as Paul Boghossian, who view such approaches as inevitably devolving into a form of relativism in which political motives compromise the epistemic rigor of the interaction. In response, Alison Wiley has argued that Boghossian, quote, radically misrecognizes the complexity of actual research practice and ignores the contingency of our evolving epistemic norms. So it's not, we're not settling with relativism, but we are recognizing different contexts and different epistemic norms that have to be managed to develop productive collaborations. So, and there's advantages, there's epistemic advantages to this. She says collaborative partners can bring a critical distance to our own assumptions. They can raise new questions about our background concepts, the goals of our inquiry, and the conventions of practice and norms of justification. They can challenge our self-understanding as inaccurate, and they can draw out uncomfortable truths that funding sponsors may not want to be made public. So there's an epistemic payoff for relational humility. A last point on this issue of relationships I want to bring in comes from this anthropologist named Sharon Treweek, who studied physicists. Instead of going to some far distant village, Treweek went to nuclear research laboratories and spent a lot of time writing about what was going on among physicists and the importance of trust to build not only relationships, but to secure the success of their research projects. She argues that trust plays a key role in gaining access to what she calls the informal discursive domains in which key knowledge is imparted, necessary for adjudicating the quality of evidence. Most knowledge, even in physics, is not codified, but involves what is sometimes called know-how. And as I said, she was observing high status research communities and noting the way in which when newcomers came in, so students are always involved in the laboratories, the ways in which she was looking at the ways in which the students were trained, even in these exemplary empirical fields in which variables can be controlled to a much larger extent than like in biomedicine. And sometimes the variables can be isolated from their contextual effects. Research still involves an extensive know-how about how to become a qualified practitioner. One learns to direct one's attention and about the controlling narratives that legitimate the preferred methods. And most importantly, Treweek found that all of this know-how was developing and being communicated in the corridors, in the hallways. Corridor talk, she says, is rarely written down. It doesn't appear in the journal articles or in the lectures, and yet it is widely discussed and vital to the development of the skills of scientific practice. Because this know-how is not codifiable, it can't be put into codes. Its transmission involves insider communities that have the ability to engage in informal interactions. And of course, this involves trust, robust relationships, even if, they're hierarchical to some degree. You have professor and student, but there's specific motivations they have to collaborate in this way. What Treweek is describing lines up with the concept of metis used by the political theorist James Scott to describe local knowledge. Metis are uncodifiable methods of judgment used by peasant farmers around the world to prepare crops, test the soil, predict the weather, and judge seed quality. The effective use of metis can be verified empirically based on the yield, right? So you have there you can still empirically judge the metis, but they are a form of know-how and irreducibly local. So assessing the quality of our relationships that have been involved in any research project is not a political luxury. It's not germane only to certain fields of inquiry, but it's an epistemic necessity in order to assess the legitimacy of claims to have justified belief. And there's a lot of work being done on these 2 points. But I want to turn now to the second two norms. These are the incompleteness of all knowledge and an approach to inter-epistemology. Boaventura de Sousa Santos is a sociologist of knowledge, calls for a principle of the incompleteness of all knowledge on the grounds that the development of existing sciences and technologies has been both historically contingent and substantively affected by arbitrary contextual conditions. And this is, this view is accepted today by most historians of science. De Sousa Santos puts it as follows. He says, quote, "There's no essential or definitive way of describing, ordering, and classifying processes, entities, and relationships in the world." Dalmia puts it this way: "If I look at the world differently, I will cut up the world differently." And so Helen Longino is another person who subscribes to this view. And has a lot of case studies in her works. Her most recent book on human behavior, 2 case studies. What she shows is that multiple approaches to a phenomena may each have some empirical success, but remain incompatible. They may each have some empirical success of prediction and yet remain incompatible theoretically, resisting empirical comparison, and so resisting being distilled into a more comprehensive whole. But it's still possible for the varied modes of description and classification to be critically judged, she argues. So the claim of incompleteness is familiar in 20th century traditions in the philosophy of science, especially the so-called historicist trend developed by Imre Lakatos, Thomas Kuhn, Hilary Putnam, Paul Feyerabend, and many others. Putnam argued that the impressive success of the sciences in functional outcomes and prediction is compatible with the partiality of their ontological picture of the world, based as these are in contingent conceptual repertoires. So incompleteness does not challenge all versions of scientific realism, because any given ontological picture of the world may be partially correct. Dalmia and others use this nicely vague phrase that I used earlier, cognitive contact with reality, right? That's a very loose and vague phrase, but it's meant to describe the aims of empirical knowledge in a way that's loose enough to allow significant representational variation. But the historicist school of Lakatos and Putnam did not take the theorem of incompleteness where Sousa de Santos takes it to motivate engagement with other forms of science and other epistemologies. The incompleteness theorem should motivate an openness to divergent ideas, practices, and ontologies, and ask political questions about why there is so much resistance to this. Lorraine Code has suggested that the desire to assemble the confusion of the world into maximally homogeneous units is motivated by the pursuit of manageability, mastery, and instrumental simplicity, not knowledge. So she develops this concept of ecological thinking, which is a diversity of approaches that seek an ideal of cohabitation, of living well together. And I think we might use this goal to define the fourth corrective norm I listed, inter-epistemology, which is a quest for cohabiting multiple epistemologies. There are two central reasons to embrace incompleteness and inter-epistemology that I think will help us make the decolonial turn. The first involves the centrality and ubiquity of local knowledge, understood as knowledge that is resistant to codification or decontextualized analysis. And there's lots of case studies on this, but I can give you some ideas of where to find some case studies on this, but I want to go to the more theoretical claim. I think the first reason motivating incompleteness in interepistemology is, as I've said, the contextualism of scientific research. So it's not just negative effects, but it's also productive ones. And we also need to recognize, as Frieda Vogelman argues, the complex and layered nature of what it is we're trying to present. So we are contextual and variable, and that which we are trying to represent, that which we're trying to have cognitive contact with, is layered and multidimensional. There are whatever we're trying to present, whether it's history full of contradictions, the strange relationship between the physical and the non-physical, the resistance of legible causation patterns in human behavior, which is what Helen Longino's work shows. And I think here again, a picture is perhaps holding us captive, as if a clear, orderly, and permanent portrayal would ever be finalized. So, Janardhan Ganeri, I mentioned earlier, explains that thinkers of the Jaina period believed that reality, though one, is multi-aspectual, has multiple aspects, and that different aspects of this single reality may be the focus of different styles of inquiry. An epistemic pluralism that could support an inter-epistemology approach is motivated both by the necessarily contextual nature of all science and by the nature of truth. So Ganeri says the following. He says, quote, "We might eventually build up a complete picture of reality, but such a picture itself would not be a view from nowhere. It would be better described as a view from everywhere." So we might attach connections, in other words, he's saying. Accepting incompleteness and following through on its implications motivates the need for a concept of inter-epistemology as an alternative to epistemic imperialism. In her critical analysis of climate research, Brenda L. Murphy calls for an inter-epistemology that explicitly acknowledges that there are knowledge frameworks beyond Mount Science. And she argues for an approach that decenters the academy and admits the existence and value of parallel knowledge systems. So this orientation, I think, helps us in the conflict over demarcations between theories to avoid a preemptive ranking of participants. Code and D'Souza Santos both advocate for what they call an ecological approach that engages with epistemic diversity on the ground in a piecemeal fashion, self-critically cognizant of one's own specific location and context as well as others, while deflating the transcendent pretensions of some science. D'Souza Santos holds that in the ecology of knowledges, finding credibility for non-scientific knowledges does not entail discrediting scientific knowledge. It implies rather using it in a broader context of dialogue with other knowledges. So, getting to conclusion here, some worry that the term epistemology itself is bankrupt, that it's connected too closely to a modern European struggle against skepticism, whose demand for certainty conflicts with relational humility. David Ludwig, who writes a lot in the global epistemology world, he writes that he can accept epistemology in plural forms, but that the singular epistemology creates a risk of policing the boundaries of epistemology and philosophy that's both theoretically shallow and politically problematic. And Walter Mignolo has at times argued against the use of the term epistemology itself for fear of sort of the weight of its usage in the modern West, which carries framing assumptions that deny the interpretive element in knowing. So the point of using the term epistemology is precisely to encompass multiple framing assumptions. So I think it's compatible with Mignolo's aims. Important and influential trends in 20th century Western epistemology and philosophy of science, such as pragmatism, historicism, hermeneutics, feminist epistemology, naturalized epistemology, and some versions of social epistemology and political epistemology today allow for the combination of hermeneutics with epistemology so that we can recognize the ever-present existence of interpretation as a critical feature of theory choice, of deciding which theory is most apt to cognitive contact with reality. So I want to conclude here just saying that I think the concept of interepistemology can help shift our focus to conditions required for optimal collaborations precisely because of the constitutive nature of interpretation in every stage of knowing. So, what I've been arguing is that the decolonial turn is not as challenging to epistemology or philosophy of science if we consider the last generation of developments in internal realism, pragmatic realism, contextual empiricism, and epistemic pluralism, all of which can be distinct from relativism and still maintain that concern for truth that Soren Clausen is concerned about. Many emendations to traditional ideas about good scientific practice have been well tested in the field. Still, because the decolonial turn requires a thorough critique of the myths of European Enlightenment, this turn is facing increasing opposition by philosophers, I suspect, but also by science practitioners who are embedded in institutions and funding streams that inhibit sharing power. These structural problems are perhaps the most important of all. The ongoing extraction of knowledge, the hoarding of the knowledge of processes like vaccine production, which was just horrific in this last epidemic, and the easy utility of colonialist prejudices to legitimate and build hegemony around these practices. Thus, to quote Adorno again, philosophy compels our practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk. It it is as enlightening, we can say. Uh, and we can start questions if it's okay for you for the talk. May I start with my question, or if there are other questions? Okay, I start with my question. The when we start speaking about decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing epistemology, uh, one of the most common critics is the problem of relativity. And today you discuss decolonizing epistemology does not mean relativity. And at the same time, there are and there's a common belief that the scientific world of us belongs to the Western power and Western science. And although there are now some critical studies, recently I read James Postcott's Horizons, which seeks for the Western science roots in colonialism, how colonies helped to improve science. Anyway, my question is that in when we start decolonizing epistemology, and how can we consider technology and it is kind of power of universal power which dominates us today?
Yes. There's actually a great book by Prabir Purkayastha. Are you familiar with his work?
No, I'm not
Um,
being.
he's quite interesting guy. He's an engineer and
Mhm,
also a philosopher of science and of technology. And he has a book called, he has several books, but he has a book called Knowledge as Commons,
mhm,
which I recommend. I've used it in my classes, in which he looks at of technology as well as other kinds of natural sciences that philosophers, pay more attention to than we pay attention to technology. And, it's interesting because technology is the product of engineers, and engineers think differently than physicists do in some cases. They're thinking about how to build something.
mhm,
They're not thinking about what there is,
mhm,
but how to build something. So, in some ways, they're more, open to different models, to the idea that there are different models that may have effective, capacities to build. Um, and he thinks that it part of the problem we have in philosophy of science is that we put technology out. We study philosophy of biology, we study philosophy of physics, we don't study philosophy of technology as much. So I think your question is, it is quite important, and it could shift our thinking. And he thinks that science and technology are actually integrated. I mean, if certainly in physics, you have to build things. You have to build accelerators in order to uh, produce your empirical um, results.
mhm,
So there is a building capacity, there's a making capacity, and that is always constrained by context in a variety of ways. So you can build it in a certain way in some contexts, and that determines the kinds of empirical evidence that can be generated to justify your theory.
mhm.
Um, so it's very contextual and very partial. I think if we, I'm not sure if you're thinking that technology is a challenge to decolonize, is more of a challenge
In
to
At
decolonize.
least it is said by anti-decolonizing, but at the same time, it came to my mind. This maybe you read the new Palantir manifesto written by biggest AI companies, and it gives us the feeling that we have to decolonize this mentality. And it shows the power structure of this techno-scientific world.
Yes, it's horrifying. We're all quite horrified by this. I shouldn't say we all are. There are some people who are making huge amounts of money. And so I mean, it's a perfect example though, because it's so much about control and management, right? As Lorraine Code is suggesting and Karen North-Satina is suggesting, that the organization of knowledge production is assuming a certain closedness of expertise of who can, develop these systems, and a closedness of the assessment of these systems, and certain ideas about, so those are ontological assumptions, those are epistemological assumptions, right, that are being made without examination, without critique, without engaging with public feedback on that. So the quality of the relationship that's producing this stuff would not satisfy my test, but of any relational humility. Um, but the goal of it also is management of populations, and the funding sources are also driving this. They will fund certain kinds of knowledge projects and not other kinds of knowledge projects. So that context is has an epistemic effect on the knowledge that they are claiming and the knowledge that they are producing. And that context, therefore, should be part of the epistemic analysis of their claims. They can produce certain kinds of, but the error rate, is very high for a lot of these surveillance systems. I just heard on the news this morning that we're because we're in a big sports moment. The World Cup is coming to New York. My family's so excited. Um, and there's surveillance systems that are using facial recognition to try to keep terrorists from getting into the arenas. And they recently identified an 8-year-old girl as a terrorist based on facial recognition, right? So we're not getting good knowing practices from the ways in which it's being produced by these people.
Thank you. The other question is by Professor Erdal Yılmaz. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Alcoff, for the talk. I have three small questions. Two of them are connected to each other. The other is about terminology. So, my first question is that it is entirely possible to decolonize epistemology. Why I'm asking this question? The reason is that uh, as far as I understood your approach, so all these collaboration to decolonize epistemology will not happen totally conceptually, rationally, or theoretically. So it is based on also emotional structure, So when we encounter with other from different culture, if our culture or the things that we have in our culture affect his situation emotionally, so how can we say that this process will happen uh, uh, totally, unquote, neutrally? It means we will not affect them, they will not affect us. Together with collaboration, we construct, an epistemic structure. This is my first question. The second question connected to this one, um, uh, I guess you are familiar to the concept concrete universality created by Slavoj Žižek by referring to abstract universality in Hegel. So for here, I don't totally agree with Slavoj Žižek because
Good.
as far as understood, he underestimates the power of culture. He said individually we can connect, we can discuss all these things, and then we achieve the concrete universality. So I guess, he underestimate the power of the culture, tradition, etc. So in your approach, in the process with this collaboration, will the culture, different culture, become too close together at the end? Maybe in the process, totally all different culture will be similar to each other. This is the second question. And the last question, You especially emphasize the concept collaboration instead of dialogue. Gadamer, especially, he emphasized genuine dialogue because in genuine dialogue, each culture are equal. They take their position, and they discuss, to achieve the truths of the subject matter. So, is there any special reason to emphasize the concept collaboration instead of, for instance, genuine dialogue? Yes, thank you. Thank you for again this talk.
Thank you for the questions. Erdal, maybe
Yeah.
I'll take the last one first and then go to the other two. I use dialogic epistemology also a lot. So dialogue can be very useful. I mean, dia assumes there's just two sides, and collaborations often have multiple sides. But I don't think, and I think dialogue sometimes assumes verbal, um, verbal relationships, and sometimes collaborations operate with limited verbal relationships, but communicating in other ways. But I don't, I'm not opposed to thinking about this as a dialogic approach. And I think that's in a lot of the literature that I'm drawing from. People talk about dialogic approaches here. Um, you raise questions about emotions and about cultures, which I think are very important. The I think what works when collaborations are most successful, it is when there is a shared goal across both sides. And that happens some of the times, not all the time. In archaeology, it can be a shared goal to understand what is this artifact, what may have been its true uses. So there's a shared epistemic goal on both sides, in many cases, which motivates, okay, let's stop, let's sit down, let's try to understand what the other side is saying, let's try to collaborate and share our knowledge. Of course, shared interests are not always in existence. Like with Palantir, I don't share the goals that they have of this kind of population management, organization, and surveillance, and so forth. But so we have to look at what are our goals? Are there some goals that we have in opposition? Are there other goals that perhaps we have shared goals? And based on the shared goals, it can motivate the process of collaboration to be done well. The issue with emotion, I think, is very interesting because for a long time, emotions have been seen as separate from cognition, separable from cognition. In the last 40 or 50 years or so, I think in the English-speaking world, this has been breaking down with the work of people like Martha Nussbaum and Michael Stalker and others who are arguing that emotions have cognitive content. You can be very angry at somebody for being late to a dinner date that you have set up to meet them in a restaurant, and they're like half an hour late, and you're just furious, and they get there and they tell you the reason that they're late. And once you hear the reason that they're late, your anger just sort of goes away. So there's a complicated relationship between our emotional states and our cognitive states, that we need to stop seeing our emotional states as sort of animalistic, automatic, unreasoning states, and that our reasoned states have no emotions. Both sides we need to re-understand. We need to re-understand our reasoning side as connected to emotions and passions, and we need to see our emotion and passion side as connected. And that can help us I think, in collaboration when we have these emotional reactions, right? We can think about, we can try to explore them rather than just trying to suppress them. I think oftentimes people just try to suppress the emotions, but no, they are telling us something. They're giving us some, it would be very productive for us to spend some time with those emotions to see what we can learn and thus how we can continue a collaboration. I think in terms of culture, yes, I think we need to understand that our cultures, and the word culture, a lot of social scientists hate this word because it gets over essentialized and it's sometimes presented as if it's historically unchanging and as if it's completely separate. In the book that Kader mentioned that I just published a few months ago on race and racism, I have a big chapter on cultural racism. And I'm using Said and this Cuban theorist named Fernando Ortiz, who began to develop this concept of transculturation. But I think we're talking too much about racism as biological racism, as psychological racism, as individual racism. We need to re-enter cultural racism into the conversation about racism to see how we hypostasize, we sort of make cultures into these absolutes. Our cultures are interacting, and even when there's a power difference, the culture from below, the culture from the less powerful group, influences the culture from the more powerful group. And so, but that's not to say that there's no cultural differences. Religion, of course, makes a huge difference in the way in which we understand our lives and our values and our relationships, the myths, the stories, the narratives that we have available to us. So when something new happens, we connect it to the narrative that we have available to us. That's the way I think to understand how cultures operate. It's not a diminution of reason. It doesn't mean that we're not reasoning properly when we do that. We're reasoning properly when we do that. But we have different narratives and different experiences available to us to put the new event in relationship to gain some understanding of it. So I do think that interactions across culture definitely produce cross influences, but I don't think that the incredible weirdness of human beings, our capacity for invention and interpretation anew will stop, and that we will all meld into one. I think Zizek is, I agree with him so often, but when I disagree with him, I disagree with him so strongly. And issues of difference in culture and identity are part of often when I find myself disagreeing with him. I'd love to talk to you more about this, but that's...
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A student of our department has a question, Nur, then Chidem, then Ali Said. Yes, please, Nur.
Okay, hi. First of all, thank you for the presentation. My question is about the part you talked about the corridor hall talks. You said something like it had its importance even if we cannot codify them and add them to our contextual science. So how we can like make sense of them, because I also agree with you on with this part, because I find it sometimes more natural and more realistic, especially when professors or students talk philosophy with their natural language, because they actually, without the restrictions of the context, they can like improve their ideas more freely, let's say. So how we can make use of this?
Yes, a good question. I think in all of our fields, these corridor hall talks are important in the way in which we learn our professions and share knowledge. And it can be challenging. What Terweek is looking at is how it can be challenging to our efforts to diversify our research teams, whether it's in philosophy or physics. I started out in physics, and I know that lots of conversations in hallways, informal conversations, convey information that in some cases people don't want to put in a published article. They don't want to trash somebody else's work in a published article, but they'll do it in the hallway. But also, they're conveying certain ideas that are not completely expressible and, and that are not completely codifiable. Because when you're interacting in person, unlike on Zoom, you have the full interaction, right? So you see the emphasis, you see the emotion, you're getting more information, which, linguists and sociologists are so good at sort of helping us understand how communication works in that full-bodied way. And I think in my experience, it is especially challenging for diverse research teams because I was like the only female physicist, physics major, and in the beginning, one of only two uh, female philosophers. I didn't go out to the bar with the guys. I didn't socialize with the male students. I was married. Sometimes I had kids at home. I couldn't do it, but I didn't want to either. And so you get restricted from those informal interactions that can be very important for learning a field and for really, getting a lot of the insider knowledge of the field. And it's just, we have to rethink how we understand what knowledge is and how knowledge is taught and how knowledge is communicated, and move away from these ideas that you can put it all in a text. It's through these informal interactions, and it's through sometimes communication that is implicit rather than explicit. And we're judging each other's credibility, we're judging each other's expertise in some ways that are not codifiable, that are implicit rather than explicit. So it's hard to sometimes call people to account when they're prejudiced against us, because it's hard to really get the evidence that they are prejudiced against us. And they may not even know, they may be just doing it unconsciously. So this is why we need to think about collaborations that set aside questions of expertise that are determined prior to the interaction, that will determine who can be in the room, who can be interacting with each other. We use these conceptions of expertise and credentials to segregate out some populations, including indigenous scientists in some cases, because they don't have the credentials. They're not in the room, we're not engaging in interaction with them. And this has a negative impact on the sharing of knowledge and on the development of knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Çiğdem, please.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk, and it was very nice to listen to your talk again in this context when I'm in Turkey. I listened to other talks by you in the US when I was in Memphis. So I actually wanted to ask a little bit more about relational humility. That really helps me to kind of sort it out how to deal with this relativism issue, I think, and how the worry that if we let the epistemic plurality happen, what if all kinds of claims pass as truths? That's but it is a kind of fallacy in a way. But and that reminded me how in critical thinking in the very beginning, at the very 101 level, we actually learn this, but we somehow forget this because in the beginning of philosophy, we keep learning this truth as an epistemological value, as a universal value, but we forget how in critical thinking we already actually learn how character is very important for logic to happen, where all the intellectual characters, and one of them was humility. That that concept you already gave me reminded me of that, and that is. I think that's something similar to relational humility. So I was going to ask more about the source and what would you think about that? Because there too, if the fallacy takes over, then it's not pluralism, or it's not anymore relativism in the sense of we are hearing all kinds of truth, but it is actually a kind of a form of like hiding the truth in the sense that we are not fair, and in order to understand that, we need a character development as well. So it's not just logic that helps me, but it's a kind of a critical thinking with logic. It requires this character work as well, and that is also humility. And making it more contextual or relational is actually even more helpful in that sense. We try to understand what is fair or who is fair, and then it will I think it helps to also see the distinctions between the oppressed and oppressor, etc. So that's maybe more like a comment how I like the relational humility here. So thank you again.
Well, I'll just say, I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think the relational part is trying to say we have to think about our view of the other as well as our view of the self. So I'm aware that I don't know, but in some cases, and not in all cases, of course, not in all cases, but in some cases, I should open my mind to think that the other person or group has some knowledge that I do not have.
Mhm.
And I may not be able to obtain it completely, but that they do have knowledge that I do not have. And and what I think extends this concept of relational humility is if we begin to look at the growing interest in local knowledge and know-how and métiers, as Scott calls them, that is knowledge that again is not codifiable, farmer knowledge, peasant knowledge of how to grow a crop in a very particular weather conditions, very particular soil conditions, very particular context, and what the local animals are, and this knowledge cannot be completely put down in a book of how to do agriculture here. You need to recognize that there are people who may be illiterate, who may not have language skills of written language skills at all, but who have enormous knowledge of how to build things and how to grow things and how to mitigate climates, etc. And that relational humility has to be permanent, right? I can't go and get their knowledge and write it down and then give it to others and then it's done. I have to maintain the relationship with them and the local knowledge condition because they have it and I don't, and their knowledge it's one of the examples that I use in my extractivist epistemology paper is the neem tree, which is this tree that actually grows all over the world, but was especially researched in India because of its capacity to provide a kind of non-chemical pesticides. And the Western companies came in and wanted to patent the neem tree. They wanted to have exclusive rights to the knowledge of the pesticidal properties of the neem tree. And so they argued that the local peasants who were cultivating the pesticidal properties of the neem tree didn't have knowledge, and they also didn't see that their knowledge was based on many, many generations of experimentation and of cultivation, of trying out different things that is, passed along across the generations. And so it's a very robust form of knowledge that resisted the language of patents, but it took like many, many millions and millions of dollars and coalition across groups to get the courts to recognize the knowledge of the neem tree that was held by the farmers in India, and that should not be so that if the Western producers of pesticides wanted to say that you could not, nobody could produce pesticides based on the neem tree except them. They had exclusive, so they had to put bounds around the knowledge of this process. And so there's a lot at stake in how we define knowledge and how we think about how we think about what can be codified and who are experts, and what is our relationship to others. So I think it's a very important concept, relational humility.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ali Said, please, your question.
Thank you. Thank you for this interesting and very rich, I think, talk. It's really inspiring for us because in our countries, like our countries in the third world, decolonial theory is not known well because we are under very, very clearly powerful of Western culture, So I send greetings to you. Thank you very much for this courage, philosophical discourse and philosophical thoughts. I don't ask something about the detail about your speech, but just I wonder something about your situation in USA. If it is not personal, of course, if you can answer this question. I know there is still a very powerful tradition coming from Said and Spivak, etc. Decolonial theory, critic theory. But I feel, or I guess, I'm not sure this is my question, there is still very, very big barriers or obstacles or, academic barriers, institutional barriers against this kind of critic to directly Western, sovereignty, Western hegemony. So can you give something else? Can you give information about your struggle in USA, please?
Yes, there's people are losing their jobs. They're losing research funds. Nobel Prize winning scientists are losing research funds. You probably have heard of all of this. It's and we have mixed emotions about this in some ways because we have characterized other countries often as not fit academic environments. And now we're showing we do not have a fit academic environment. I think one of the things that's at stake here is that the former colonizers in Europe and the United States have enormous wealth and still control finance capital around the world. And their justification for controlling this wealth is the ideas that I'm discussing today, right? It's the ideas that Western science is the best, the technology is the best. And that proves that the West was justified in its imperial incursions into the rest of the world. It was justified. It brought modernity, brought science to the rest of the world that it assumed did not have it. So there's a legitimation of ongoing imperialism and colonialism in the sciences in particular. And so I think, we have to rethink this, but that's what's at stake for them. And that's why they're coming after us in the academy and wanting to control what we say. They're censoring people's syllabi. So there's a level of both formal, open, and above board censorship, defunding, and control going on. And then there's also an underground of threats, intimidation, all kinds of, death threats and things that are targeting particular academics in the United States by what I call paramilitaries. Paramilitaries is the term used in Latin America to talk about ostensibly independent groups that would harass guerrilla groups, but they were not really independent of the governments. They were sometimes funded by the government. They were allowed by the government. The government did not go after them even when they murdered and tortured all kinds of people who were trying to rise up in rural areas. So we're experiencing both formal control and intimidation and informal control and intimidation. And all of it is affecting me, but I am very lucky to be at the City University of New York, CUNY, which is a public institution and which is strong. We have 500,000 students. And so we have enough, we're not dependent on government funding as much. We know how to work on a shoestring. We know how to do things without much money, like many of you do. So I feel I'm very happy to be here. The people at Harvard and the people in Columbia and the people at Yale and the people in the more high status institutions are suffering more. The academics are suffering more in some cases because they are more entwined with the national government and with funding sources that are getting cut off, and funding sources from millionaires and billionaires that are getting cut off as well. So it's a dire situation we're in, a very difficult situation. We don't know what the future is going to bring, but there's a lot of resistance, a lot of organized resistance as well. So like everywhere else, right?
Yes. Last two questions from our students. Yes, Eylül, please, you can ask your question. Eylül?
Just a second. She is trying to open the.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry for the delay.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for this talk. It was great to listen. And I hope I understand it right. But you mentioned that epistemic pluralism and contextualism and similar approaches can still contain truth but still be distinct from the relativism. And I wonder that how can we, I guess, value different approaches or different ways of knowing while avoiding relativism, or what is the line there, maybe?
Yes. Yes, I think that's a good question. Relativism is kind of a defeat, it's saying, I can't engage with your knowledge project or your way of knowing. So I'll just accept that you have your way and I have my way. So relativism demotivates collaboration, I think. People think, well, relativism means that we have respect for other knowing systems, but I don't think you really do when you take a relativist position, because you're saying you're doing something incommensurably different than what I'm doing. I'll let you do that. I'll respect it. I'll call it knowledge, but I'm not going to engage with it. So epistemic pluralism is a different approach, and people are theorizing it in different ways. There's this concept of the stance, the epistemic stance that Guarneri develops to think about a more, a way in which we are operating in our knowledge projects differently with different ontological presuppositions and so forth, as I said, and practices. I think what can help us think about this is in Helen Longino's work on human behavior. What she shows, she's looking at explanations of violence. Why are some people prone to violence and other people less so? How do we explain this violence? And so there's these human behavior models, and they're very biological. They're looking at genetics. They're looking at, the whole range of possibilities to explain the behavior. And there are two models that she looks at that both have some epistemic success. They have some ability to predict violent behavior, but they actually cannot be compared. You cannot compare the two. You could compare the two both on what their effective behavior is, but you can't actually compare their causal models because they're positing different ontological characteristics of the human person, behavior, body, mind, etc., that are not compatible. So pluralism cannot be overcome by, in this case, by a unified model of human behavior, because these two very well funded and have been in place for many decades, as she describes, and they both have a certain empirical success, but they cannot be combined. And it doesn't really make sense to choose one rather than the other. She thinks both have some positives and both have some negatives. So pluralism is what you adopt in this kind of case, right? Pluralism rather than relativism. Pluralism means that both have some epistemic benefit, some epistemic legitimacy, and we're going to understand both of them as continuing to operate. That's not relativism. That's not saying everything is true. There are some models that can be rejected, right? As not meeting that. So I think that's the idea of epistemic pluralism. There's still a concern with truth, And there's still a concern with comparing truth in terms of often practical effects, but it's not possible to actually dissolve all of our ontological differences and practical differences and conceptual differences that are the context for the theories that we develop, to dissolve them all into one unified theory. It doesn't mean that that goal is not useful, that may be a useful goal, but I think we're a long way away from achieving that. Right now, what we have is a lot of epistemic pluralism, which we need to find ways to collaborate across and to philosophically conceptualize what this pluralism, how to understand this pluralism. I hope that helps.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And Yusuf, please, you can ask your question.
Yeah, I really appreciate your speech. It was really interesting, and I really wonder about your views on scientific realism and how it relates to this framework, because
We cannot hear you, Yusuf.
Yeah.
Can you? We couldn't hear the last part. Yes.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying that I wonder about your views on scientific realism and how it relates to your work. You mentioned this in a very quickly, actually. When you quote, when you make a quotation from, was, I think, yeah, I forget about that, but yeah. So how is it related to traditional scientific realism? That was my question.
Yeah, I think that was probably the quote from Hilary Putnam. So there's many different forms of scientific realism. There's instrumental realism, there's pragmatic realism. There's the field of realism has diversified into these different kinds, and which is quite interesting. And I think that the pragmatic realism is probably the one that works best with this idea of wanting cognitive contact with reality in some way. So you have the motivation of cognitive contact is practicality. Can I build something? Can I predict something? Can I learn about something that has some contact with reality? So realism is still there, motivating us and working to help us judge between competing claims. But the ways in which, for example, Charles Taylor and Hubert Dreyfus argue, and I think many of the pragmatic realists and other kinds of realists that I like are arguing, is that reality may be subject to multiple ontological conceptual models, right? So it's not just that we're inadequate in our conceptual systems at this point to provide a kind of perfect cognitive representation of the world. It may be that the world is itself multitudinous. And all these thought experiments that physicists are coming up with come up, which imagine the possibility of multiple worlds. String theory, I think was a failed attempt at this, but the idea of we need to be open to the possibility that the universe is much more complicated and variegated and not, in fact, representable in a single form. And I think in practice, it's interesting to me because when you talk to actual scientists, most of them don't care about these arguments that we're having with each other, right? They don't care. They're interested in practical effects of the research that they're doing. Can they generate evidence? Can they generate sufficient evidence to, do something with, do some kind of prediction or making something with? And whether or not that evidence should be taken as a sign that the universe actually has this thing called quarks, they don't care about, right? So they're not really interested in or worried about the representation of the connection between our ontological concepts, the posits that we create, and the way the world really is. They're interested in their knowledge projects and their goals in their knowledge projects. And those are compatible. As Longino's work shows, you can have two distinct ones that are positing different representations that each have practical effects. So pragmatic realism is a way of saying we're going to assume justifiably that pragmatic effects indicates that we are in contact with reality. So there is a realism because we are aiming to have contact with reality. But it takes away the idea of the unified global theory that Einstein, to the day of his death, hoped that we could achieve, which would be a single unified representation of the world. You don't need a single unified representation of every aspect of the world, the tiny ones and the large ones, in order to have practical effects, or in order to claim that we are engaging, we are making some contact with the world. I don't know what you think about that, but that's the idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just had a slight internet connection problem, so I'm sorry for that.
It's okay.
Thank you, Professor Alcoff. I think we are at the end of our time, and thank you to all listeners and for your questions. It was really a rich talk for us. And in Turkey, there are not many people who work on decolonial studies, but there are some studies, and we are in a very colonial situation, although we are not aware of it in Turkey. I don't want to enter the details of it. Thank you again, and I wish we could host you in Istanbul in
Yeah.
person. But the university stations all over the world.
Yeah.
I hope in the future it will be possible to host you in Istanbul.
I would love to host you in New York if you want to come to New York. At some
Yeah.
point in the future, maybe such collaborations will be easier than they are at the moment. But I appreciate all the questions. I wrote them down. They're very useful for me, so I appreciate this very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll see you later. And if you need